What if the story you were taught is not the only story? I am the one who will walk with you through records and ruins, not to answer, but to hold what is fragile. Where are you now? What time is it where you listen? Breathe with that place and that hour. We will move slowly. We will not hurry each other. If you would make this a ritual, subscribe and return. Bring these silences back with you. The question begins here, as a hush over clay and stone, and we will unfold it slowly. The story, as it circulates in accepted forms, is orderly. Divine architects emerge from the mists and shape the world's first settlements with purpose. The mythology settles over the past like freshly fallen ash, each figure placed, each task assigned, each city lifted from the hands of gods into the inheritance of humankind. Labor and language, measured in origin and meted out as sacred duty. One presumes the record to begin there, at the threshold where creation myths declare their primacy. It is the assumption that resonates through tradition, that the world's work arrived trailing narratives of intention, of higher will, of gods who decreed order and inscribed it into the human heart. Yet, on the ground, below the liturgy and after the stories, another evidence endures, silent and persistent. Not a mythic origin, but a trace preserved in clay, anonymous, fragmentary, unadorned, the destabilizing presence of a collection, administrative tablets, unearthed from layers of river silt and silted time, bearing the plainness of routine. No invocation, no genealogy of divine intent, nothing to elevate the record into the sung or the remembered. Only impressions. The shallow press of a stylus. Wedge marks arrayed in patient rows, numbers gathering alongside names, measures, units, sequences, each a minor tally, cast in the temporary permanence of wet earth hardened by waiting. These artifacts do not speak in parables, but in count and allocation. Grain issued here, barley measured there. Workers named perhaps out of habit or necessity. Children accounted for as new increments of the day's ledger. A city not yet illuminated by the later brilliance of myth, but already busy, already dividing the hours and its harvests, each tablet whispering, almost beneath the level of narrative, the ongoing requirements of subsistence, the tasks assigned, the rotations logged, the hands that shaped the city's bones before the tales gave them lineage or purpose. It is a cool register, one that records not extraordinary moments but the regular tick of obligation, the undramatic calendar of daily bread and necessary labour. The language of these tablets is neutral, almost tentative. Wedge marks in the clay, ordered but without flourish. The hand that impressed them is old, older than the temple chronicles that would later claim precedence. The record survives in silence, numbers trailing off into nothing at the tablet's edge, names truncated by a break, a list ending mid-column. What is present is only what was necessary to note at the time, an allotment, a ration, a cycle. There are no appeals to the gods, no framing within a cosmological story. Columns of grain, measures of oil, the residue of events that refuse to shape themselves into a tale that could be retold. Your own gaze becomes archival, tracking the inkless memory from preserved fragment to preserved fragment. To hold such a tablet is to press yourself against the opacity of another time's accounting, to confront the stubborn mundanity of ancient life, the way the clay yields but does not answer, the way the script arranges itself, in the logic of necessity, not myth. There, in the shallow impression, is a worker whose existence is affirmed not by story but by number. A child occupies a fraction of a ration, a name barely registered before records shift focus. No narrative swells, only the logic of distribution, recurring as often as the need itself. To read the sequence is to recognize that it is not a narrative, but a procedure. It is bookkeeping, strictly. And yet, in its repetitions, a peculiar resonance grows. What is left unrecorded becomes palpable. The world outside the scribe's focus drifts into indifference. At the edge of each tablet, the clay goes unmarked. The column ends abruptly. A silence seeps into the space where meaning might have accumulated, where, much later, myth would rush to fill the void. One is left with an inventory of rations, labor rotations, births marked as a sum rather than a story, memory excised, not lost but never rendered to begin with. At the limits of the tablets, you sense expunged memory, the register halts, and what was once present recedes into the uninscribed. These ledgers do not invite you to reconstruct a world animated by belief. They deny you the closure of narrative. The surviving record is one of subtraction, withdrawal, and drift. A tension stirs between the plainness of the archive and the lushness of received myth. The past divides along the seam between what was meticulously counted and what was later gloriously invented. There is only the slow, relentless calculus of the ledger, cycling through seasons, indifferent to gods or origins. Viewed from the long night of history, these tablets withdraw even as they speak. Their neutral tally haunts the later chronicle with the rawness of order that does not require a beginning. Each wedge mark, with its resistance to interpretation, sketches the outline of a society before stories. A faint pattern etched before imagination devised a first cause. Memory is faceless. The archive, by surviving, also refuses to tell. At the final edge, the record returns to dust. The silence is palpable. You face a register where memory was shaped only by the requirement to remember enough and to omit all that did not concern the daily arithmetic of life. You are told a story whose lines are worn smooth by steady repetition. The first furrow in every field, the rise of the first roof, the arrival of bread at tables. The touch of a god or something like a god, charting the first calendar, sowing the first rows, conjuring harvest from unyielding soil. This belief we inherit, lightly, almost unconsciously. Civilization begins when divinity decides to intervene, and crops tame, orderly, edible, are set down amongst wild seed and uncomprehending soil. The memory persists not as evidence but as a shape in the mind, a convenient threshold that divides before and after. Before, chaos. After, cultivation appointed and explained. It is a story so complete that the in-between vanishes. But beneath the accepted grounds, in places set aside for gods, the soil holds other testimony. Not a voice, but a pattern that resists neat narrative. Here, the remains do not announce themselves, nor do they contradict directly. They surface in fragments, in conditions that demand patience. In a floor, sealed and buried well before any temple dreamt its first corner. Carbonized seeds endure, blackened traces but still seeds, still cereal. They rest quietly, surrounded by the silent hush of ancient clay. There are imprints too, delicate shadows of husks pressed into ceramics, not by intent, but by the slow weight of daily living. Impressions stilled in wet earth, preserved by chance and repetition. Each fingerprint, each shrunken kernel, a residue of hands and harvest. In the catalogue's columns, microscopic charcoal fragments are tallied by distracted hands. Flotation samples are weighed, sifted, dried, and dotted with small indicators of presence. Seed morphology projects across tables, measured in careful increments the width of a kernel, the contour of a husk, the depth of a scorched groove. In glass and paper, samples are stored and relabeled, shifted from drawer to climate-controlled shelf. Dates arise, quietly, from laboratories. Each test a faint assertion. No clarity emerges, just a range. Before ritual, before the walls that later bear devotion. Before the so-called beginning, stratigraphy becomes a slow, careful witness. The lowest rooms, the earliest floors, speak in silt and charcoal. Layer upon layer, soil accumulates, but does not forget. Above, a later order constructs its precincts for gods, and the calendar defines the sacred with stones. But underneath that prescription, the dirt keeps records. The strata preserve what was not meant to be marked, thin slips of organic matter, weed seeds, known to grow persistent among rows of millet and emmer, food waste deposited and burned, accidental kindling, all of it consistent, all of it persistent, all of it domestic. The quiet hum of tending, layered in silence, speaks through years that were never named, and seasons that are now nameless. In the dark, there is no story, only residue. Weeds whose assemblages cluster with those found in managed fields, species that do not congregate by chance, but by repeated turning of earth. Remains of food preparation found where no granary stood, arrayed in spaces bounded only by mud brick and proximity to an old fire. Cooking, not for ritual, but for life. The forms repeat gently. Bread in the heel of a hearth, grain left in the corner, a slurry of chaff trodden into a clay floor. No single moment, no single hand. Just cycles layered on cycles, the trace, then the erasure, the mark, then the silence. Records are kept, not in journals, but in the progression of time, and salt, and stone. Seeds are carbonized, accidental witnesses, neither revered nor discarded with intent. The effort of flotation brings them up, one by one. Charcoal fragments, minute and stubborn, are swept onto glass slides, measured, counted, archived. Each morphometric scan cares little for legend. Husks, pressed into clay, inadvertently immortal, line the slip beneath a later wall. Their arrangement is not ceremonial, not grand, but meticulous in its evidence. They endure because the ground was sealed early, forgotten beneath a structure dedicated to later gods. These are not statements, only conditions. Observers move in silence. Record keepers draw lines, assign codes, preserve samples against future ignorance. The oral thresholds mark beginnings, set apart as if nothing preceded the word of divinity. But here, in these sealed rooms beneath, the logic of domestication unfolds with no audience and no script. Layered time evades explanation. Each stratum insists on its own continuity, its own slow memory. When the soil is disturbed, the archive shatters, seasons effaced, purposes lost, and a hush that outlasts regret. Silence inside the earth persists far longer than any proclamation, resisting the urge for clean beginnings. What, then, tended the fields before the gods' calendar began? The prevailing story is told in outlines traced over centuries. The first signs of authority are those of the gods. The earliest visual language, it is said softly and without dissent, was written in the iconography of enthroned deities, crowned and encircled by symbols of rule. That is the line drawn through the dust. The narrative passed quietly from one catalogue to the next, from lecture hall to display case. Authority, borne aloft on divine headdresses, is presumed to have spoken first in images, and only later in law or proclamation. An assumption so long held it becomes the background hum of the archive itself. But the evidence rests elsewhere, not in the monumental, but the almost overlooked. A group of small cylinder seals, unearthed not from temples or tombs, but from the soft, yielding soil of a domestic refuse pit. Their discovery interrupts the accepted sequence. This is not the locus of sovereign iconography, but a midden, a remainder, a scattering of daily leavings. The destabilization is subtle, not loud. No proclamations carved in stone, only the hush of ordinary objects pressed into the earth's forgetfulness. The seals, incised stones, withdraw from expectation. They disclose human figures, yes, but not enthroned. There are no divine emblems, no kingly titulary, no unmistakable crowns. Instead, what is seen sometimes clearly, sometimes only through the smudge of age, is a choreography of unadorned hands, tools, and doorways. The observer enters the record quietly, encountering these objects first as forms, then as indices of departure from tradition. Each seal, small enough to be hidden in the palm, bears repeated motifs. A figure standing, bending, holding, reaching, passing beyond a lintel, beside an opened or half-closed threshold. There are hands, always hands etched with a care that suggests neither worship nor command, but rather the rhythm of use. The stones themselves are softly burnished at their edges, their wornness a register of handling, of repetition not ceremonial but habitual. The human gesture becomes the dominant sign, imprinted over and again, always returning to the moment of contact between person, object, and passage. Context 43b. Domestic pit, layer 7. Associated material ceramic fragments. A child's bead, charred grain documents the ordinariness of the deposit. These are not the objects of ritual precincts but of households, of kitchens and doorways. Their survival is not the result of veneration, but of disposal. The writing is careful, the measurements exact, but the voice is impersonal, retreating even as it enumerates. There is no hint of importance, no annotation in the margin. The record is silent, save for the bare facts it is compelled to preserve. One seal in particular, rotated under the low light of the storeroom, offers only ambiguity. A pair of parallel lines might be a doorframe, or merely a border. The figure beside it could be stepping within, or poised to depart. Another, darker with the patina of long burial, is marked by wince-like scratches, fingers, implements. The forms evade certainty, repelling easy alignment with known iconographies of king or god. Where one might expect diadems, the insistence is instead on practical presence. The making, the carrying, the opening, the small events of passage. Here, the motif is not throne but threshold. No titulary appears, no glyphs naming ruler or divinity. The register is almost mute, the stones content to show without announcement. Divine headdresses, markers of otherness, of distant legitimacy, are absent. The seal's circumference, worn smooth by hands now forgotten, carries a faint residue of touch. It is the human mark, endlessly recurring, located not in spectacle, but in repetition. The iconography is stripped back, reduced, receding from the vertigo of sovereignty into the grain of household life. Under glass, these objects recede again. Numbered and sorted, their images diminish behind taxonomy. Seal 1062, Seal 1063, Seal 1073. Their context slips back into the museum night. A hush between closed drawers and the slow drift of archival dust. They wait, not displayed with the emblems of kingship but pressed into the quiet of backlog. The sense of familiarity, those hands, those doorways dissolves beneath layers of curation and glass. Their motifs, repeating with minor variations, seem to whisper, persistent and unintelligible, from a place before authority was pictorially enthroned. Silence is their attendant, a silence punctuated only by the low, deliberate hum of preservation. So it is that the catalogue line falters. The expectation of sovereign symbolism is weighted now by an alternative. A continuity, silent, oblique, uncelebrated, refraining from spectacle. The record opens a tension, unresolved, between what was thought to be the inception of visual authority and this other evidence, a vocabulary not of divine kingship, but of household identity, ordinary presence, commemoration without proclamation. The objects settle, year by year, deeper into the drawers, their catalogue numbers patient, their forms familiar to none. You peer through the glass, feeling the chill of absence. There is no voice to guide you, only the mute persistence of line and shape. What did those hands mean before a throne was made? The story you have always been told begins with certainty. Temples rise in the primordial dusk, anchoring the restless settlements that gather around their sanctity. In this sequence, the city grows outward, emanating from the divine, drawing order from ritual, sheltering beneath and beside the sacred stones. Everything established, arranged, foundations as declarations of intention. The world begins here, or so it seems. But the ground is not an idea, and the soil does not obey the neat lines of inherited narratives. There is a record, less visible than legend, pressed flat beneath the weight of carved blocks and mortared joints. Cut deep into the settlement mound, the archaeologist's section exists as a wound in time, a thin, still window where order unravels. Stone foundations, thick and deliberate, resolve into view. They rest heavily, asserting architectural will where the world had once been soft. Yet beneath even these, where the trowel edges feel a change in texture, a shift from rubbly fill to compacted surfaces, there is something else. Floors, Domestic, unpretending. A sequence. Dry packed clay, patches of hard-packed earth scored by thin cracks, a lens of faded charcoal embedded in grey-brown silt, fragments of burnt bone pressed flat, seeds cracked beneath heel or hand. Everyday substance sealed away, rendered anonymous by the future that rose above. A context number is penciled in square brackets onto a battered fines register. The layer is photographed, its edges meticulously defined by a mechanical pencil on acid-free paper. Each soil change noted, each stray potsherd marked as either inclusion or intrusion. A hearth discloses itself as a scorched hollow, blackened now to the colour of cold embers, surrounded by a halo of heat-altered clay. Its margins are blurred, showing repairs, reusing, the evidence of long, practical persistence. The hearth was not an event, but a practice. Years spent stoking, scraping, patching. The midden, too, reveals its hesitant voice, layered quietly until the day when the threshold changed. Every deposit, every interface, is rendered as a soft transition from one tone to the next. You read the diagram from top to bottom, from present to past, but the real direction is both ways at once. Above, the ordered fill for temple foundations, stone, and compacted soil, intentionally laid. Below, a quieter logic. In between, thin lines mark transitions, not sudden events but sippings of routine into forgotten intervals. The mind returns, again and again, to the moment of sealing, the filling in, the levelling, the burial. Domestic labour made residue, then erased by ritual ambition. The act leaves no inscription, yet the stratigraphy is unequivocal. Under the pillars, under the carved altars stained and retouched by centuries of hands, domestic textures remain. They are not erased, only obscured, flattened by devotion, quieted by the weight of memory, transfigured into stone. What does it mean to find a midden beneath an altar? The practical monotony of waste, meals, mending, child's footprints pressed into drying clay, sealed now by sanctity. The record keeps its silence, but the form of the evidence is tension itself, not a clean break, but a compaction. The threshold is ambiguous. The stories that climbed skyward from the shrine's dedication are layered over the slow, horizontal accumulations of life. Each phase overwrites the last. The boundaries always both clear and blurred, and the past remains only as disruption beneath inscription. There are no names. The observers and record keepers inscribe only numbers, section labels, grey bands on a drawing, a photo in dim light. Someone shakes soil from a stone pestle with hands that do not tremble. Someone else transcribes the thickness of a charcoal deposit, uncertain if it is habitation or later intrusion. The palimpsest is preserved not by desire, but by the indifference of time and the persistence of routine. So the narrative bends, quietly, under pressure. The presumption of ritual origin is undercut not by argument but by stubborn sediment. A new chronology, less absolute, emerges from the soil's innermost memory. Temple does not come first. It is built upon a lineage of forgotten flaws, on the residue of lives not illumined by incense or song. With every pass of the trowel, another threshold is crossed. Each context is numbered, each profile traced. The silence deepens as the trench fills again with dust and late shadow. The section closes, annotated and archived, a chapter in a book that remains unread at its deepest pages. What name is given to the last hand that filled the midden before the altar rose above it? There is an old story, retold in the careful language of textbooks and museum guides, that the turning of the human age is marked upon the land by the movement of peoples. You are told to expect arrivals significant, mythic, or ordinary, heralded by the footprints of families. Sweeping changes revealed in the structure of the bones, the composition of the bodies, the markers worn quietly within them. Population movements are accepted as physical facts. Encoded, perhaps, in the slow encroachment of unfamiliar customs, or in new hands pressing unknown shapes into the soil. The body, in this assumption, is a text. The text holds transitions, disruptions, bearing evidence of great crossings and the weight of inherited journeys. The story is meant to be plain. The layer is crossed, the horizon is breached, and the old gives way to the new with a signature written in flesh and bone. Across rows of tables and under gentle lamps, sample trays hold enamel fragments, teeth sorted by grave, by depth, by the silence of centuries. Each tooth is plain, unremarkable, dulled by earth, marked by time. But the tools are precise, and the process is steady. The outer surface is cleaned, layer peeled from layer, with a slow, grinding patience. You watch as powder is gathered, sterile and small, before being placed into prepared vials. The rigor is unbroken. Each label, sample number, burial plot, date, and the cryptic shorthand of fieldwork links a fragment of enamel to a person who once pressed tongue to palate, who bit, chewed, swallowed, lived. The protocols are thorough, calibrated across seasons, across years of careful repetition. Strontium isotopic analysis unfurls, transforming mineral fragments into ratios, into numerals. There is a baseline drawn from groundwater and local stone, the slow geology of the region evident to those who read such scripts. The teeth, fallen after a lifetime's work, are measured against rivers and dust, against the local map of mineral signatures. Data renders the invisible visible ratios that belong only to this place and this alone. And here the anomaly grows. The record keepers mark the date of each grave. There, a burial before the storied arrival, and next to it, a tomb aligned with the new era after the supposed horizon has been crossed. The assumption waits for rupture. Surely, the teeth before the change shall bear a different water's mark from those after. Yet the ratios repeat. Tables show consistency. Generation folds seamlessly into generation. The local strontium signature endures, unvaried, across graves divided by the supposed boundary of transformation. Teeth grown in the old time and teeth grown in the new time are equally and quietly of this earth. The data is insistent, quiet, repetitive, the calm sediment of 1,000 measurements. These are not theatrical witnesses. The teeth hold their silence, locked behind numbers and baselines. There is a kind of obstinacy in the laboratory logbooks, each entry a flicker of the same conclusion. The people here drank the same water, ate the harvest drawn from the same fields, inherited the minerals of the ground beneath them. In the tables, the division between before and after does not assert itself. Where movement is written in legend, the enamel remembers only the rivers carven in stone, the calcium filtered by ancient aquifers. The tension grows, not as a spectacle, but in the enduring, persistent lack of difference. The assumption becomes weightless, set adrift by the density of local data. The near silence of evidence, refusing to confirm arrival or departure. Sample after sample, the laboratory notes return to baseline. Initials of the technician, batch number, the line of the instruments read out documentaries of care, circumscribed and finite. It is monotonous and exact. There is comfort in such repetition, and yet discomfort too, for the expected break, the mark of migration, is always deferred. A memory is locked somewhere between code and mineral. Each line in the logbook is both a statement and an absence. This tooth, too, is local. This one, too, belongs to this ground. The record keepers do not comment. The data is left to accumulate, impartial and fixed. The story is not rewritten. It simply continues to unwrite itself with every sample measured and every ratio plotted on a calibrated grid. What remains is the gentle gravity of the archive. Rows of vials, labelled and ordered, uneasy with what they have not found. The teeth are not speaking, but neither are they silent. They offer only what they can, a residue, an indirect memory. They allow the slow drift of time to settle upon them. Each hand that lifts a tray, unaware of the precise season, encapsulated in each grain. These are not dramatic artifacts. These are materials of patience, of slow decay, of the seasons compacted into memory and form. If something once changed, if a great horizon was crossed, then the enamel has made no declaration. Instead, A biography of unremarkable days gathers, layer by mineral layer, in the mouths of those who lived and died without legend. The water that shaped them persists below the surface event, a witness immune to story. The question returns, quiet and unsatisfied, carried by each silent archive in its tray. Whose water marked those teeth before the story changed? First comes the settled narrative, as old as the soft dust that gathers on thresholds. Ritual architecture, they say, supersedes the warren of the commonplace. The temple timbered, the altar roofed, long before the smoke rises from any domestic hearth. The sequence is canonical, asserted in text and tradition. First the sanctum, the priest's passage, then the house, the walls of sleep and spill, built at the margin of the sacred time. The primacy of ritual woodwork, measured out and set among the stones, accepted unruffled, lined through the chronicle as a certainty that folds silence around itself. One either walks in the temple's shadow, or not at all a before and an after, the sacred, then the domestic. A grain running crosswise to doctrine. Quietly, under the settled dust, there is a beam spanning darkness, catching only the thin sift of morning. In the laboratory, against fluorescent stillness, timber is sectioned and counted, the core drawn out in ribbons. The record unfolds with impartial patience. Here, the cut surface. Here, the proliferation of annual rings, calibrated by steady hand. Cross-matched charts lower to the table like muted verdicts. Wood reveals its years only to those who linger. It speaks in the language of increments and interruptions, a grammar of expansion and drought, rain and retreat, inscribed by time and cut free all at once. The beam is lifted. Its heartwood is still rich, the sapwood paler. All growth stilled. The rings are tallied, each counted twice, first by the eye, then by the chart. Timbers, embedded into sacred walls, mortised for columns, joined for lintel, are felled far after the upright stones of the settlement's houses. Sawn and seasoned years, sometimes centuries, after adjacent domestic structures found their place and settled. The evidence is inert, yet heavy. Dendrochronological graphs, black on white, curve quietly away from the expected. This evidence is layered. There are marks hidden along the grain. Some beams are scored with simple carpenter's strokes, hatch and number, a cryptic ledger where each incision records intent, even if faint and fragmentary. Preparation for mortise, half-chiseled, unfinished or corrected. The details are not consistent with the first momentum of sacred construction. These are not the deep, careful channels of inaugural build. Instead, the wood is scored, spliced, sometimes crudely wedded to older posts. The joint is not always true. Repairs echo through the timber. Some beams end abruptly, sawn and spliced, the joinery a patch more than an origin. The lab's record holds only line and unit, but the wood speaks of mending, of moments when measure was met with necessity, not prescription. Each specimen is reduced to fact species, identified, dimensions articulated, join preserved for study. Ash, oak, sometimes larch, their distribution mapped and date-stamped. The ledger notes where beams are reused, mortised anew to fit a later form. Here, an episode of repair. There, an awkward splice. Evidence is registered, tagged into a chronology that does not harmonize with liturgy or myth. Each entry in the archive is a neutral observation. A ring count, a chart, a carpentered sign, a splice that interrupts memory as much as it preserves structure. But the fracture is quiet. No proclamation undoes the precedent, but the patchwork remains, and the archive, impartial, records what is found and no more. The wood is heavy, but the record is quiet. There is no voice to explain why these beams arrived late. Only the shadow of hands returned to once sacred ground. Silence pools in the places where expectation and evidence refuse to align. It gathers in the gap between the original plan and the mended lintel, between the prescribed order and the patched span overhead. The traces of repair are neither secret nor explained. They are simply there, unfamiliar, unassimilated. The possible stories gather behind the grain, waiting but unnamed. In the record keeper's hand, the archive halts. All that is solid is indexed. All that is uncertain is left untouched, preserved in the pause between notation and knowing. What is seen is registered, catalogued, stored. Then the file is closed. The rooms return to darkness. The dust resettles on stone and on timber. The evidence persists, a chronology both there and elsewhere, challenging, unresolving. A question persists in the residue of numbering and grain, in the silence after the final ring is counted. What hands reworked the beams after the houses had settled? It is said patiently, without contest, repeated in the white echo of lecture halls and the dust-heavy corridors of archives, that language's first breath in clay or ink arrives shaped by the sacred. The oldest inscriptions, we are told, push up from the earth, clothed in myth, their symbols fusing the imagined order of gods with the counting of time. Writing, in this origin, leans forward from the unknown, bearing declarations of cosmic dawns, legends rooted in silence and early awe. In this arrangement, what endures from the beginning is always a hymn, a list of ancestors, a story ringed by the fires of creation. Under this assumption, the beginning is myth, and everything that comes after folds itself around that core. Yet, a hesitation. The tablets do not all agree. In locked quiet, behind the sealed doors of climate-controlled rooms, some objects sit layered surfaces scraped and used again. Palimpsests announce themselves only to those who look twice. The innovation is not mythic, but procedural. Erasure, repurposing, a record overwritten. Clay and ink are not infinite. Stories seed to lists, lists to stories, and under the pressure of reuse, the first layer is not always the one we have been taught to expect. Refracted across technologies and file drawers, some see it first as a shadow caught in spectral imaging, the faint signature of lines just beneath the surface script. The archival process, methodical and hushed, produces catalogue entries. A tablet's dimensions, its weight, the note that under certain light, under raking angle, under calibrated wavelengths, something else, older, paler, becomes visible. There are squeeze impressions, the reliefs captured in pliable material to preserve what the surface cannot yield to the naked eye. There are secondary ink traces, these ghost marks that map the passage of stylus or brush not once, but twice. Silence lies heavy in these marginalia, the sense of a hand pausing, hovering, preparing the ground for the next layer, knowing perhaps or not knowing what comes before. Tables, numbered, cross-referenced, the database entries reflect not story, but sequence. Overtext in formal script, sometimes in the language of temples, introduces the gods, the rituals, the obligations that lift the mundane closer to the transcendent. This is what is now most legible. The second layer, pressed bold by generations of copying and reverence. But beneath, emerging where the overtext thins, there are lines that do not participate in the myth. The undertext is quieter, an accounting, a ledger, columns of rations, allocations by weight or number, counts of sheep, vessels, barley, place names punctuate routine. Here, there, this threshold, that storage room. Some of these words dissolve into the grain of the clay, almost illegible, but the sequence persists. They are records, inventory, the blunt economics of a community marking what passes through human hands and into memory. The neat layering, the tidy geology of ideas begins to blur. The tablets do not howl, they do not protest. Instead, their surfaces are record keepers of absence. The erasures are methodical, a pressure applied just long enough to obscure, not long enough to efface completely. Sometimes, the top layer nods to the erased. A flourish echoes the movement of an earlier numeral. A god's name barely covers a number. Sometimes, there is no nod at all, only the silence of what was rubbed away, leaving a faint topography visible only to those who linger, whose eyes adjust to see what was not meant to remain. Hands there is a trace of many, though they go unnamed recur, in this economy of surface and substance. Reusing a tablet, inscribing ritual over receipt, these actions take place slowly, matter-of-factly. Between each layer, a breath perhaps, or many years drained like water from a basin. These are not eruptions of revelation, but gradual sedimentations, each one compressing the meanings before it, pressing myth over measure, measure under myth. The neutral record becomes an index not of certainty, but of surface pressed against surface. The slow drift of stories atop lists, devotion settling over detail, the past weighed but never quite eradicated. This evidence unsettles. The harmony of myth-first writing crumbles beneath the simple, persistent shape of bureaucracy. If the underlayer is not divine, if the first marks are ordinary, what is the value of what survives? Yet, in describing the evidence, the catalogue refuses finality. No hierarchies are given, only stratigraphy. What sits above, what lies beneath, what remains between. To archive a thing is not to resolve it. To see both surface and depth is still not to know either completely. The catalogue grows, and silence thickens around what cannot be conclusively said. All that is certain is the pattern and endless rewriting, an unquiet balance of concealment and display. The air stills, the tablet rests. Under words, other words, breath exhaled, and then stillness. There is a belief, persistent in the literature and quietly lodged in professional memory, that mortuary change marks the arrival of the unfamiliar, that a cemetery's shifting lines and altered goods are not merely traces of time, but banners raised in the wake of new religious actors, moving quietly but deliberately among the dead. It is a familiar sequence, a before and after, a visible border drawn in the churn of rites and tokens, in the rotation of bodies and the pattern of objects placed along the mute horizon of the bones. One stands at the threshold, waiting for a rupture, expecting the register of faith to inscribe itself suddenly, legibly, irrevocably, here in the earth. The model asks you to believe in transitions that thunder, and yet what remains is quieter. The ledger of evidence complicates. In the fine dust of the pit, what rises is not rupture but continuity. Not banners, but the steady patience of sameness. An excavation dossier opens, its thickness composed not of drama, but of lists, skeleton inventories, context sheets marked with pencil and numbered tags, photographic scales half embedded in marl, margin notes on soil chemistry, a faint yellowing on archive paper. What unfolds is gradual, almost stubborn. Across a period named transitional, its boundaries set by others, the evidence traces circles around retention. Pottery types flicker, yes, but only with the gentlest variation, appearing and receding, their forms evolving by degrees rather than by leaps. The expectation of crisis is met instead by repetition. Bodies lie lengthwise, a pattern. Dust clings to femurs, humeri, the gentle curve of rib cages nesting in shallow profiles. The field book describes positions supine, hands resting across the pelvis, skulls canted slightly to one side, as if in the privacy of sleep. Each entry is undramatic, a small accumulation, body after body, year overlaying year, wrists folded, ankles aligned, the cut of the trench precise and unchanging. Context sheets, crisp at their edges, map the location of grave goods. A vessel by the knees, a bead at the chest, a chipped blade near the fingers, again and again, the pattern returning, indistinguishable from what came before and what follows after. Photographic scales, black and white, chart centimeters that do not betray upheaval. A chain of context cards, organized by context number and brushstroke, reflects only iteration, no break. Soil chemistry reports note the slow dissolution of bone, minor shifts in composition, but offer no evidence of new purification, no hint of innovation through foreign touch. It is a quiet persistence. The ledger is steady, almost murmuring. The grave, once exposed, breathes out nothing of confession, nothing flamboyant, nothing revolutionary. The assumed model, new doctrine, converted gestures, altered ritual, collides with the stilled forms. Instead, there is regularity, The vessels do not shift position. The orientation holds its axis. Goods cluster in familiar zones, echoing lines traced decades back. The field notes alternate between observation and silence. Each measurement, tibia length, cranial index, soil pH, serves less as revelation and more as ritual itself. The observer becomes a recorder of returns. Each data point another refrain in the song of the familiar. Absence fills the void between expected change and witnessed constancy. The photographic prints, faded at the corners, accumulate not transformation, but an archive of sameness. To read the evidence is to tune one's attention to the gradations of dust, the echoing hush of repeated acts. The field book's handwriting lapses, at times, into pallid quiet, a notation cut short, a page half filled, the day's silence heavier than the record. In what is preserved, there is no surge of iconography, no sudden fracture in custom, only the hush of prolonged observance. Pottery forms age, their shoulders softening, glazes thinning. The viewers, the ones recording, persist in their notations, often writing the same words: knees, chest, vessel, bead. Even the tools follow routines. Brushes, sweeping sediment from ribs with practiced care. The cemetery, undisturbed, does not announce its transitions. It accumulates them, grain on grain, until discontinuity is a theory, not a practice. Absence persists, and it measures. The skeletons themselves have become the medium of this kind of unremark. Each remain returns us to silence, to the steady calibrations of what was left, what endures, what slips from notation. No song admits itself to the record. No new pattern insists on introduction. The persistence becomes, itself, a kind of shadow, the impression of hands, caring for remains not as innovation, but as continuation. If there were witness, they left only index and measurement. The graves stretch out, quietly, through the chapters of years, and the field notes lose themselves in pale reticence. There is a quiet authority in the accepted account. Mythology, it is said, comes from beyond, delivered by the sanctioned touch of external gods, by the processional arrival of divine patronage, by emissaries from a citadel on a high hill or across a rolling steppe. The shaping of metal, the melting of ore, the art of alloy. These become not practices, but inheritances, bestowed upon those chosen below. This telling is inscribed on the margins of every ledge and every curated timeline, reshaping memory into dogma. The assumption persists, not defended, but extended outward in habit. Before metallurgy, there was only waiting. After, a sanctioned order rearranged by outside hands under a greater sky. Yet, there is a drift, a slow, silting accumulation of evidence, neither loud nor formal, but insistent in its granular specificity. The compositional analyses arrive with no heralds but themselves. Metal artifacts, uplifted from the dust of early domestic contexts, present themselves without invocation. Their signals are measured and stored XRF spectra, showing the elemental composition, lead isotope ratios, tracing a story not to mythic traders, but to a seam beneath local hills. Iron-grey inclusions of slag and the micro-pitting left by careless tool impressions. They do not explain. They record. They persist, documented in the rigid grammar of scientific method, in rows of figures and spectral lines that offer the possibility of reading without certainty of the text beneath. The evidence is solid, but only in the way stone is solid, silent, reticent, cool to the touch. The artifacts materialize from midden layers, where household refuse and the cadence of habitual life accumulate. They are preserved not as treasures, but as residues of the ordinary debris in the stratigraphy of living. Hearths, rather than sanctuaries, cradle the detritus of metalworking. Taken from these layers, fragments of crucibles, marred by heat and hurried hands, hammer-flattened ingots, their surfaces mapped by repeating marks, neither craft nor accident, a rhythm caught between effort and improvisation, a spoon rim miscast and abandoned, the trace of intention faltering at the edge of possibility. The residues cluster quietly. Set apart from the precincts of temples and the gaze of statues, they do not confess to the machinery of ritual introduction. In the record, the catalogue lists them as they are found, not narrative, but index, crucible fragments, blackened and sharded, grouped by proximity to clay hearths, slag, glassy and dense, with air bubbles marking the cooling. Each ingot is weighed, measured, the composition written in the columns of a ledger. Here, the archives do not embellish, they only note. In the neutral light of the laboratory, evidence is fixed, not translated, not interpreted, but frozen at the threshold between artifact and information. Photographs, field notes, sample bags drawn tight and labelled with dates that cut against the flow of story. There is tension here, a weight that neither settles nor escapes. The narrative of elite-introduced innovation presses outward, mapped in the long shadow of citadels and carved monuments, where applied knowledge is supposed to descend through chains of hierarchy. In contrast, the striation of residues beneath hearths, the local fingerprints of alloying, the tool marks inconsistent with formal training, all suggest a sedimented practice, not a revelation, but an experiment, a cautious trial at the wet edge of a home, a provisional shaping before formal names are given. The tension does not resolve but accumulates. A history told in granules, not generalities. Time outlasts its own telling, the slag piles now dull in the archive. The record book closes, pages pressed flat to hide the looseness of the evidence. Excavation jackets are zipped and stored, polyethylene shrouding the remains of process rather than progress. It is the residue that lingers, sticking to fingers and memory alike. What cannot be seen is preserved in omission. What is not measured remains as an open interval between knowledge and forgetting. There is, in the end, no clarification. The silence between claim and artifact is deliberate, methodical even. The catalogue does not err. It only stops at the limits of description. Under the dust, within the folds of stratigraphy and the folds of time, there is the suggestion of hands working metal before the sanctioned story arrives. A learning that is neither fully visible nor erased, shadowed by chronology, waiting for the right attention. Lid is snapped shut on half-read spectra, samples replaced into darkness. With each noting of an ingot, a crucible, a rim unfinished, the uncertainty accumulates not with systems, but with silence. The archive is complete in its gaps. The evidence waits. There is a story the surface tells without hesitation. One hears it repeated steady, familiar, in the measured tones of the established record. Irrigation, it says, radiated beneath the auspices of order, rippling outward from a single sanctioned point. Large-scale waterworks, both their inception and their annual care, are taken as the signature works of centralized rule. Authority inscribed in mud.bric, in stone, in the sacred geometry of gravitation and fall. Water, drawn and divided, was managed by the hands and decrees of central planners, priestly councils, the proctors of the measured earth. This belief resettles itself each time a tablet is deciphered, each time a royal name surfaces faintly through silt and centuries. Each line, traced confidently, becomes a rehearsal in the power of decree. It is easy to accept this. It sits with us, ringing quietly, almost comfortably, in the background hum of things that have always seemed known. Along the margins, beneath the assumed gridded force of authority, something interrupts, small, at first, but persistent. It waits in the reluctant silence of a mapped canal's gentle curve, in the hesitant geometry where edges refuse perfect alignment. The evidence does not rush forward. It accumulates, fragment by fragment, profile by profile. Section drawings emerge cross-sections of soil sliced and mapped, each a measured incision into ancient substrate. In the shadowed cleft of exposed earth, the strata unravel. Compacted alluvium, ribbons of finer silt, the dark band of ancient organics. A canal cut, now choked and still, reveals itself as neither singular nor absolute. Its path swerves, narrows, and expands again, its banks caving, mended, overbuilt, and then abandoned. A thin steel cylinder, pressed downward, rotates through history, through outwash and leaching, through the fine tasks of roots and water. Silt settles into glass, then is coaxed, millimetre by millimetre, onto a table where there are only numbers and colours recorded, quietly. Here, phytoliths, those quiet witnesses of grasses, cluster in some layers. Glass-like and minuscule, they signal the sorts of cultivation that ran alongside the water, the measure of things harvested and returned. Sometimes organic-rich units surface, dark with what clings from ancient field margins, thick with a persistence of matter. The evidence is not loud. It shies from the kind of clarity that stories like to claim for themselves. There, tucked within, are patterns the canonical accounts would prefer to silence, channels that do not march from a single boundary corner but accumulate incrementally by selective, widening, narrowing, patchwork repair. Here, the mark of localized activity is not overwritten by subsequent master plans. Instead, it is layered, inherited, occluded, and then partially revealed. Not a monument, but the incremental, repeating process of mending, of use by families or neighboring plots seen in the subtle differences in bank construction, in the telltale seams where one patch of silt rests awkwardly against another. No one drawing claims this as intentional. There is only quiet accumulation, marked by mild dissonances, a shift in channel's grade, a pause in the texture of sediment, an uneven thickening of organic remnants. Patterns emerge, withheld from dramatic assertion by their very ordinariness. Survey profiles, remember, because stone forgets more completely. Here, on the drawn map, are field boundaries that cross the lands months or even years before the first sign of a cadastral record. The tablets, drying and cracking in their time, come late to the scene. The land, it seems, was already scored by cautious furrows and provisional embankments. Yet these are not the rigid and permanent tracings of formal orders. They flicker, sometimes lost in a wave of silt, other times restored by the mere presence of a return flow. The evidence insists on being partial, fragmentary. It asks not for declaration, but for patient observation. Increment by increment, the fields became more than the sum of their boundaries. A conversation, perhaps, not of voices, but of imprints, made and lost, made again. Still, the old assumption remains, refusing to retreat quickly. Hydraulic order, it was said, could only have emerged when power lay centralized, when sacred or secular authority spoke with a singular voice and the water bent in turn. The canal, then, should reflect a first moment of drawing, a command, a beginning, a clean incision. But none is visible where the stratigraphy is most honest. There is much more muddle, more palimpsest, than legend admits. In the silence, a memory lingers, pressed between layers of unremarkable earth. There are banks, softened and edged, edges reworked so often they have become more idea than structure. No witness stands to recall those first furrows. Every surveyor, every observer, is left to wonder, quietly, at this unsettled scene. What has time chosen to remember, and what has it already covered over, silent beneath generations of compliant dust? Who first dug those furrows into the earth before lines of authority were drawn? There is an assumption, fixed and almost invisible, that the earliest astronomical records came wrapped in the language of decree. The vision handed down is one of priests raising tablets above their heads, celestial truths inscribed as ordinance, woven tightly with divine necessity. The sky, it was believed, belonged to those who could invoke it, and the records we would find, if ever they endured, would be declarations, statutes, pronouncements sealed by the authority of unseen powers. To look up was to receive a commandment. To record the moon or the travels of Saturn was to relay the will of something greater, filtering starlight into law. This assumption sits quietly behind so much of what is imagined, when eyes search the dust for the faint traces of someone's sky-watching long ago. Among the remnants pressed into clay, where moisture, chance, and indifference threaten equally, sprouts a different kind of evidence. A tablet, pale and brittle, offers itself not as relic but as ledger. In place of imperatives there are lines, columns, lists, Here, celestial knowledge is not parceled out as doctrine. It is organized, recorded, set down as if by someone who cared not just for the heavens, but for the grain bent under wind, the river carving a new channel, the rhythm of planting and waiting and reaping. One tablet, its edge chipped nearly to the first column, carries entries in parallel, careful demarcations folding lunar phases against notes of barley and date palm. The movements of Venus, recorded in soft black script, appear beside the rising of waters, the first green shoots pressing through silt. Observational phrases repeat with the persistence of habit, steady and unobtrusive. They are not invocations. They do not bind the reader to ritual. The evidence spreads between the everyday and the eternal, refusing the stark border of revelation. Instead, there is a meticulous accounting. Measured dates, the measured sky, a crossing over of attention from the arc of a planet to the patient calculation of when to dig, when to sow. The columns themselves evoke silence. In the arrangement of these entries, boxed, striped, sometimes interrupted by the copyist's hesitation, the eye absorbs both what is present and what slips away. There are margin notes, sometimes nearly illegible, where a different hand has traced clarifications, perhaps corrections, or marks left for another season's reader. The ink, never more than a shadow, fades into dust, blurring columns once meant to be recited quietly for the sake of wheat and water, not worship. Instead, they note first sprouting, river at high verge, the subtle shift of constellations as the planting window drifts. Each figure is offered tentatively, as though the observer and the earth both wait, listening for confirmation the sky may or may not provide. Layered over and over, there is a cadence to these records, a cyclical circling familiar to anyone who has watched. Clouds thin, nights lengthen, soil crack or pool. The gestures of recording are echoing. A column for position, a note for the moon in its bleeding edge, a mark for the colour of water turning. Silence follows, and then another season begins, and the hands that write unknown, unnamed, resume their slow, repetitive witness. It forms no law, only an ever-returning thread of attention that touches both the unreachable and the immediate, and leaves them held, for a moment, in parallel. The act of recording the movement of stylus against clay interrupts the assumption that knowledge must descend, fixed and unchanging, from some carved pinnacle above. The tables resist monumentality. No overt authority moves behind the ink. The familiar shape of decree is absent. What survives instead is practical, cyclical, ordinary, almost anonymous. The columns, fragments of them collapse into unreadable fields, erased not by decision but by time and the brittle nature of the clay. In the storeroom, where dust gathers, these columns become columns of silence. What was observed grows dim. What was meant, if there was meaning at all beyond the act of careful watching, is no longer disclosed except as absence. You hesitate before the evidence. The familiar categories are unsettled. Celestial knowledge could be doctrine, or it could be something else, something stitched into the shared daily process of living against uncertainty. The silence of the broken tablets presses in. The assumption lingers, but so too does the disorder of what survives, the disruption of what was expected. The voices of command are not present here, only the persistent steadiness of hands repeating what they have seen, marking it once, again, and again. In the end, all that remains are the columns, the margins, the fading lines, an archival rhythm that neither asserts nor erases meaning, only persists until it is replaced by blankness. Before the sky was doctrine, before divine authority was declared, whose witness shaped these broken records of the night? There has always been a story told about the laying of foundations. It moves from voice to voice, traced on the jaws of old stones and in the hush of recited rituals, that the first act, before a wall rises or a floor hardens, is a passage through a ceremony. The accepted assumption rests quietly at the threshold of every monumental structure. Ritual founders pass through the measured stillness, carrying tokens meant to anchor the myth that will grow from this first moment, this chosen earth. into wet mortar or freshly turned soil. Symbolic objects are set with formal intention, divine formulae marking origins with absolute certainty. The myth says that beneath every cornerstone, the assertion of beginning finds a body often literal, often figurative, always prescribed by the needs of story and structure. This is the accepted order. To build is to consecrate. To consecrate is to lay claim, and to lay claim is to embed the myth itself within the stones. This is the echo, measured, almost obligatory, that survives in every quiet account of beginnings. The expected silence shifts. Evidence intervenes with its own rhythm, buried in the cold, earthbound darkness of a foundation cut, sealed away from returning light. A collection of objects, mundane and mute, interrupts the narrative cadence. They do not match the anticipated symbolic set, no animal bones arranged with ceremonial care, no inscribed tablets to summon blessing, no crafted miniatures meant to evoke gods or forebears. Instead, there are loom weights, bruised by countless passes of thread, corners worn elliptical from labour and tactility. There is a pestle, its surface flattened and polished by the repetition of anonymous hands, its function written entirely in the language of abrasion and residue. A child's toy, indistinct in features, holding nothing of gold leaf or votive inscription, only the slight echoes of play registered in the gentle smoothing of its curves. Filtered through the layers of excavation discipline, the context is preserved with deliberate attention, each object carefully registered, its coordinates logged to the nearest centimetre, its association with the monumental wall described with precision and restraint. Provenience there, below the wall's southern flank, sealed beneath clay and stone packing, absent of disturbance, each item transferred into a labelled bag, numbers entered in a table, material described in a catalogue voice that admits no speculation, not ceremonial, not obviously votive, the logbook insists. Pottery, worn, utilitarian. Loom weight, chert, grooved, broken at the edge. Pestle, basalt, heavy, discoloured from use. Toy, ceramic, unmarked. The evidence presents itself as itself, and nothing more. No inscription surfaces to anchor these items in the world of myth-making. Not one dedicatory formula carved or inked. The objects, taken individually or together, do not overtly seek attention. What appears is the patina of daily use. Slow sediment of gestures so habitual they become anonymous. The edges rubbed smooth, the surfaces carrying shadows of oil and dust, absorbed across years lived far from pronouncement. None of the items offer invitation to interpretive certainty. There is an absence, a practiced neutrality, in the archaeological record itself. No reference to ritual, no citation of blessing, only objects embedded in the technical language of stratigraphy and context. They are functional. The act of their deposition is preserved only in the barest terms, an event, now receding, without commentary or overt claim. The investigator's notes do not elaborate. The record stands quiet, its language held back, neither affirming nor denying meaning. Silence accumulates around these objects. They are collected into catalogue boxes, cushioned by archiving foam, each piece isolated yet adjacent, their story implied by proximity but never declared. The drawers close, the numbers in the ledger growing firm and cool, as if to signal that enough has been said. The evidence remains, even as the curator's hand withdraws. In their quiet, the objects do not assert themselves as myths or relics. A pestle, resting in lamplight as the inventory is checked. A loom weight, its grooves almost invisible against archival white. The toy, indistinct, silent beneath the glass cover. In this hush, once the documentation is complete, the expectation of ritual lingers at the threshold, but goes unanswered. Tension accumulates, not in what is found, but in what fails to resolve. The liturgical expectation recedes, and in its place settles the persistent ambiguity of domestic debris placed deliberately in the foundations of grandeur. What was intended, if anything, remains unarticulated, eluding the language of certainty. In the space between evidence and assumption, Only the dust persists, and the drawer closes softly, preserving both the objects and the questions their presence evokes. The memory of ceremonies, the imagined recitations, hang in the unmoving air, while what truly remains is the material fact of worn things sheltered beneath the stone. What childhood toy was placed under the cornerstone before the blessing was recited? There is a story you have heard, told again and again, sometimes in the margins of textbooks, sometimes unspoken between the lines of weathered field notes. It is an easy shape to trace. Cultivation arises only when civilized hands arrive with intention. Foundations are laid, boundaries etched. The world divides itself into wild and tamed. So it goes in the accepted memory, a dawn in which seeds spill not from absent-minded harvest, not from practical need, but from the purposeful gestures of a new order. This, so many believe, is where cultivating began. A single bright moment offered as a gift or a decree. It marks a line, before and after, darkness and then light, a civilization bestowed, and the evidence of its touch repeating ever onward. But the ruin does not agree. The silence under the stones does not speak so plainly. You descend in dust and cold, drawn not to the towering facades but to humbler remains, floors worn pale, thresholds faint as old breath. It is here, not beneath the monuments, but within the almost forgotten rooms that the sealed jars are found. Unglazed, unassuming, squat vessels with their mouths pinched tight, smeared with residue grown dark, their bodies collecting hush rather than acclaim. They rest underground, where house once layered upon house, their forms disappearing in the long shadow of time. The story shifts. When the vessels are brought into the half-light, their contents are ordinary at first glance, nothing spectacular, nothing monumental. Yet the eye slows its judgment. Jars, some intact, some fractured at the rim, cradling within them small stories, folded into seeds and the dry echo of plant dust. A scene forms, almost incomplete, sealed containers embedded in domestic earth. Long before the stones above are lifted into monument or myth, the ground is not empty. It yields layers. Soil softens around the hard outline of ceramic, a darkness within darkness. In the conservation room, the air is different, drier than the burial floors, controlled. The stillness measured by machines, and the quiet urgency of witness. Here, the jars are breached with care, their contents coaxed gently into trays. What survives is stratified, packeted by time seeds pressed into sedimentary layers, variation both subtle and precise. Some are damp with centuries-old desiccation, others crisped to a fine silence. There are reports, each line measured and dry, residue sampled by sterile swabs, patterns traced by scanning electron microscopy, seed counts tallied with a deliberate slowness, species rendered as Latin epithets and catalogue numbers. Nothing is transformed, only witnessed. It would be simple to call this a moment the birth of storage, the sudden awareness of preservation. Yet the jars disagree. Their evidence is not a single pulse, not the sharp signature of invention. Instead, you read repeated disturbance in the layers, grain caved, then refilled. A fingerprint's absent oval, a cork reseated in hasty alignment, stained at the edges where air and time have conspired. Retrieval and resealing. Over seasons, over years. The practice is not a gesture, but a rhythm habit folded into necessity. The records, neutral as dust themselves, catalogue the diversity. Millet, wild barley, bitter vetch, each entry the echo of a hand that stooped, counted, returned, preserved what might be needed, never naming origins, never claiming discovery. The myth pauses here, uncertain. All is reduced to inventory. The storeroom is cold, rows of jars labelled by number and dig site grid, the faint marks of string and tag slipping into obscurity. Their corks are preserved, pressed fragments of bark and fibre, still carrying the faint must of deeper time. Metal shelving offers no tribute to their history. Under fluorescent light, archives cool into apathy. There is only the faint memory of intent, dulled by the silence of the present. A vessel, a seal, the potential of 100 forgotten meals. No story, only evidence, left to wait in half shadow. Somewhere between the weight of myth and the neutrality of record, tension lingers, an unsettled question that cannot be catalogued. The stones outside may speak of order and origin, of civilization's appointed dawn. But within these jars, what persists is slow planning, unremarkable continuity, a cycle neither claimed nor begun. The evidence resists myth's clean lines. There is no single giver of knowledge, no hero of seed, only the half-erased trace of collective act carried by the quiet endurance of preservation. On these shelves, under dust and the exhale of cooling systems, the jars retain their silence. Their tags fade, ink dusting onto cardboard fibers, each record a muted echo. The seeds, counted and counted again, do not announce themselves. They remain resistant, dispersed, layered across years and uncertainty, their patience exceeding explanation, an afterimage in the collective memory, a presence both persistent and absent. Who counted these seeds? Again and again, before a myth arrived to name their beginning, the familiar story begins in its customary quiet. There is the foundational shape of thought, the accepted premise so often repeated, it becomes almost invisible. Specialized craftsmanship, it is said, emerges only upon the scaffold of social stratification. Roles must first be named before tasks can splinter away from the household, before labor can crystallize into vocation, and vocation can set its roots into the soft earth of hierarchy. One is to suppose a kind of grand announcement. Now you are the toolmaker. Now you are the weaver. Now you carry this narrow skill as both name and burden. This is the tale that glides easily across textbooks and enters the gentle hush of museum displays. Specialists are named, and the calendar ticks forward. It is neat, contained, institutional. Yet beneath this assurance, another current moves silent, unadorned, recorded not in proclamation, but in the edges worn by unseen hands. The clinical archive does not speak in stories. It records, accumulates, microware analysis, operates without narrative, compiling data points, surfaces, thresholds. No voice here, only the lingering aftermath of action. Domestic spaces yield bone and stone, small, unspectacular, often overlooked, found within walls once shaped by daily patience. Within midden heaps and beneath packed earth floors, these artifacts return unnamed to the present. Under the scrutiny of scanning electron microscopy, surfaces reveal their secret histories. Striations clustered in impossible regularity, polish sequenced with intent, incremental scars that map repeated gestures, repeated purposes. What did the observer see in this reflected glow? Perhaps only a grid of grayscale, the faint shimmer of worn mineral, the background hum of the apparatus. Yet the images accumulate. SEM micrographs caught and preserved the angle of abrasion, the luster of use polish, the silent signature of technique. Each becomes another trace in the archive, unvoiced but quietly insistent. Spread across a table under laboratory light, they resist translation into narrative. They remain procedural. Tool, context, surface, pattern, frequency. A typology of wear is built from these silent examples. Hideworking leaves one kind of threshold, weaving another, woodworking a third. Each recognized not from the object itself, but from the patterned intensity of absence, the areas diminished and the areas untouched. In the experimental reference collection, new replicas are handled, abraded deliberately, marked according to protocol. The chain of operation chaîne opératoire unfolds in methodical progression, each motion echoing a gesture once performed before the idea of specialization had terminology. The same patterns of wear emerge, linking present simulation to absent hands, mapping the invisibility of repeated intent. There is no single maker, no grand seat of authority. House to house, the chaîne opératoire signature persists, steady, standardized, impersonal, and yet intimate. It is both everywhere and nowhere, a skill passed in the doing rather than the naming, diffused rather than delimited. No badge distinguishes the weaver from the neighbour. No boundary wall proclaims expert from novice. No hierarchy leaves its visible mark. Instead, there is only the artifact worn in service at the table against the hide, through the warp of fibres or the grain of wood. The record keeps only what is procedural and what is absent. And always the layering of documentation. The log sheets are clinical, marked by measurement and reference number. The micrographs slip into folders. The typological charts are shelved. Use sequences recorded in thick, spiral-bound volumes. The bench is wiped down at day's end. Trays returned to cabinets. What remains in the quiet is not summary, not explanation, but the cumulative hush of evidence traces organized, corralled, stored, but not concluded. The sediment of social arrangement is silent in these records. What lingers in the margins of evidence is not the legacy of hierarchy, but the quiet endurance of gesture skill traced in repetition. Not in declaration, the comparison persists. The neatness of the inherited assumption, the diffuse complexity of the traces unearthed. The tension remains, never confronting directly, always deferred into another lab report, another measured passage along the edge of the blade. Who sits with the artifact in hand, reconstructing touch through surface, gesture through polish? The evidence gives no answer, offers no resolution. The flicker of the micrograph in the print folder fades as the laboratory light is snapped off. The pattern rests only until tomorrow, or until another observer repeats the measurement, recatalogues the signature, notes the same echo without attribution. The accepted belief lies quiet as dust beneath archive shelves and within the low-voiced corridors of scholarship. Mythic disruptions, those remembered and retold breaks in human continuity, will show themselves as abrupt fissures in the record, their severity and suddenness etched into the very matter of the earth. If a world is fractured, the evidence should register that fractured depopulation written in the signature of environmental proxies. The signal's clear, the break undeniable. The expectation persists, patient and persistent, that the land remembers catastrophe, and that we, reading the layers, will see the tales confirmed. Yet the slow patience of sediment, the silence lingering in pollen grains, resists such clarity. In the palynological and sedimentary data, what rises is not the anticipated break, but a steadiness that blurs the neat cadence of crisis. Agricultural pollen, orderly, numerical, layered streams through the depths, accompanied by the faint but insistent echo of anthropogenic signatures. Climatic fluctuations come and pass, and the record, composed of core logs, sequence counts, and age models disciplined by calibration, continues its measured accumulation. The expectation of seeing absence, an abrupt loss, an agricultural abandonment, meets instead the assertion of continuity. A chain of domesticate pollen and weed taxa, stubborn and familiar, persisting through strata assigned to crisis. The heart of this evidence is literal. Thick, core samples, withdrawn with the care of archivists, sealed from time and light, marked and documented in quiet, pale rooms. In the sediment, a chronology constructed, not felt unspools under calibration. Ribbons of earth, pressed and packed by seasons and centuries, carry within them the dispersed memory of fields, the persistence of cereal pollen, the unshowy prevalence of shepherd's purse and goosefoot, the interrupted but never vanished presence of cultivation. Against a backdrop where dramatic interruption is anticipated, the numbers and diagrams record something else, something slower, something that does not easily speak the language of rupture. The pollen diagrams unfold as patient witnesses. They show not decline but duration, not a vanishing but a persistence. Domesticate abundance resumes. Then, as if it had never truly wavered, through the intervals that were meant to signal crisis. The weed taxa so closely allied with the presence of the plough. The disturbance of root and soil return, season on season, without drama, without capitulation. The evidence demands to be regarded not as confession, but as presence. Numerical, layered, slow. Logs are made, data are counted, Calibration translates depths into age. Time compresses within the extracted segment. There is patience and reduction, silence between measurements. The crisis expected to splinter the narrative finds only the slow burn signatures of resilience, pollen traces and weed seeds, mute but unbroken lines across the length of the diagram. The record keepers, separated from the depositors of the pollen by untold generations, catalogue but do not explain, archive but do not assert. The cores, once lifted, are wrapped plastic swaddling, archival tape, a sleep that lasts years, sometimes decades. Their rings and lamina unread even by those who retrieved them. The samples rest on shelves in narrow storerooms, patient through the turning of seasons overhead. The sediment, still and dark, holds both what is found and what is unexpressed. Time folds around the field memory. In the soil's slow cycling, cornflower blue and dull olive sediment tangle, pollen persists. Seasons churn and settle. The human voice rises and recedes. Climate cools, heats, shifts in cycles. The hands that scattered seed have long since broken and drifted away. Yet the memory lingers, not as story or song, but as numerical record, the endurance of cereal and weed, the muted whisper of resilience beneath the language of crisis. The tension is steady, unspectacular. Narrative promises cataclysm, yet evidence gives instead a less certain, less dramatic kind of survival. Absence of proof, proof of presence over and again. A sense of continuity runs counter to the drama remembered or assumed. The record is both too eloquent and too silent. Persistent lines and shaded zones that, to the waiting reader, say neither yes nor no, only not yet. No sudden break appears at the depth assigned to crisis. No instant vanishing of crop or weed. Just their ongoing presence pressing patiently through the crisis horizon, enduring through cycles, and the slow accretion of dust in storerooms far from the vanished fields. There is the pollen, there is the catalogue, each a patient, quietly recalcitrant witness. Wrapped and shelved, the cores age into secrecy, their data slumbering until the next generation of observers reverently uncaps the plastic and begins again the slow, neutral scrutiny. Which seasons did the fields remember when human voices receded? The story often begins with names not spoken but carved, not invented but received. Names descending as attributes of the divine. The accepted presumption drifts through the old books and hovers over the dust. In the earlier cities, authority is drawn downwards from the sky, enshrined in titles that echo with the voices of gods. The world organizes itself under banners sanctified by unseen powers. Rulership is holy not by matter of choice, but by the logic of inscription, a logic that requires the invocation of a name greater than one's own. This is the protocol, or so it has long been believed. Authority emerges first as an echo of divinity. The priest, the king each takes up their role by swearing to a presence grander than any mortal lineage, placing the divine name first and their own second, or not at all. But then, a quieter body of evidence accumulates in the archive. Its form is small, rarely the subject of grand proclamations. Between layers of silt and the residues of forgotten rooms, there are seals. Each is pressed into clay with the pressure of a hand whose skin left no trace. The encounter is momentary but leaves something enduring, an impression, looping or linear, signifying the passage of an individual. These seals are not emblazoned with divine titulature. They do not call up the powers that order the cosmos. Instead, they present a ledger of names, names only, sometimes with the plainness of a function: potter, farmer, householder. The line between title and identity blurs. There is no mention of a god, no trace of prayer, no whisper of legitimacy drawn from above. The seal records only that someone, in this particular place and on this particular day, left a mark. Each is catalogued with neutrality. The provenance is noted, the precise layer of soil, the texture of the clay. Some seals are cylindrical and worn smooth at the base, others disc-shaped, their edges faintly chipped. The evidence is handled with gloved hands, turned so that the light can catch the negative forms. No special ceremony accompanies the act. There are no inscriptions read aloud. Instead, there is the measured silence of record-keeping, the dull tap of a stylus noting another entry in the ledger. Sometimes the names can be deciphered, though other times friction has worn away individuality until only a pattern remains. Labels persist where intention fades. Potter, farmer, householder, nothing more. The archive is not interested in stories. It is interested only in what can be retained, carried forward, duplicated in list and ledger. There is no parable, no clarification. Some were impressed as trade tokens, some as receipts, some as signatures upon the clay walls of storage jars. The intention fades as the material endures. Each seal becomes its own silence, a record of an encounter long diffused, a gesture repeated so many times that the act itself settles into habit unremarkable but persistent. Authority, if it exists here, is neither imposed nor articulated. It is catalogued. The divine does not descend into these spaces. What resides here is the persistence of identity, the iterated marking of a human presence amid the flux of daily exchange. The protocol suggests the name of the god comes first. It does not allow for this silent proliferation of personal seals, these quiet affirmations of occupation and task. The expectation is disrupted not by loud contradiction, but by the mounting evidence of ordinary hands at work. Seals are pressed, clay is marked, and the record yields nothing to satisfy the expectation of the gods. The sense of disruption comes not from what is said, but from what is absent. The tidy symmetry of the divine-led city grows porous under the weight of these traces. One is left to wonder whether these names represent a separate current, or simply a stratum that resists overlay. The impressions rest in their trays, faces dulled by centuries of touch and burial. The trays themselves communicate nothing, but the silence that pools above them presses inward. In one moment, a name is formed. Abda, Dumu, Gula, names now, abstracted to functions, blurred by the passage of time. The names become their own form of absences, relics of a process more ordinary than any liturgical act. The impression is not ceremony, but repetition. There is no crowd to witness, only the diligence of a record keeper noting the existence of another sealed exchange. As you sit with these fragments, you may feel the gap widen between what has been assumed and what remains to be accounted for. No explanations are offered. The evidence does not resolve. It simply accumulates, fostering another silence, another question at the periphery of the known. Whose name was impressed into clay before a god's name was impressed into law? In the half-light of received wisdom, there is a comfort in simplicity. The familiar architecture of academic thought stands a theory well mortared, resting on the belief that formalized instruction is born only in the precincts of the elite, behind the walls of the temple, beneath the suspecting eyes of the learned class. Skill is a managed commodity, transferred under the watchful gaze of officialdom. The accepted tableau, robes, tablets, ritualized space, a priestly hand raised in exemplum, an initiate attentive and small. What ought to be learned is sanctioned by those entrusted with knowledge, passing it downward with gravity and intent. This version of pedagogy, official and deliberate, persists unexamined until something slips beneath the door. Here, a scattering of broken surfaces, pigment clinging to clay, remind us that time is an accretion of moments lost and found. The destabilizing presence, unruly and stubborn, emerges not from the vaults of temples but from dust-laden deposits of domestic life. It is in the painted sherd, the fragment of wall exhumed from ordinary thresholds, that established order begins to flicker. There are scenes quietly embedded within these remnants. Adult forms leaning over the tentative gestures of the young, fingers splayed with the rhythm of daily task, their attention neither exalted nor ceremonious. In one, the warp of a loom forms a pattern under the slow instruction of an experienced hand guiding another. In another, the angled poise of a chisel is demonstrated, the pressure mapped from elder to child, motion repeated until it is no longer demonstration, but memory encoded in muscle. These are not scenes of divine descent. No halos, no sacred intermediaries, no dedicatory inscriptions mark them out as exceptional. What persists is the ordinariness of skill, the transmission of touch. Silence is the cataloguing language. The fragments are documented in conservation notes, each entry a measured record untouched by speculation. Motifs receive their labels, numbers ascending without narrative. Pigments are identified iron red, slate grey, ochre each shade, not a story, but a code. Fragments are mapped, joins noted as tentative rather than resolved, because joining is never final, only ever a hypothesis, subject to revision as new dust is brushed away. These records do not proclaim conclusions. Instead, they whisper the dimensions of what is present. Where the hand of one figure rests atop the hand of another, the brushstroke is faded, yet deliberate. Where a loom rises diagonally, the pattern nearly lost to abrasion. The alignment of arms suggests teaching not as pronouncement, but as participation. Imagery, dimmed by the centuries, shows what survives. Hands, tools, attentive faces, sketched on the thresholds of rooms, domestic space captured in pigment on clay and mortar. The evidence is visual and mute. There are no dedicatory texts, no explanations carved into the scene, no narrative oracle to defer to. Meaning exists in the way paint has settled into fissures, in the obscured borders of a wall join. The ritual weight of institutional learning, so heavy in textual accounts, is absent here. Instead, there is a suggestive quiet in the visual record, a space between what is seen and what must be inferred. It is within this interstice, between the formal story and the artifact, that questions pulse and subside. Institutional narratives, weighty, intact, corroborated by centuries of repetition, are challenged not by loud contradiction, but by the subtle resistance of imagery from the hearth. Here, transmission is not staged. It is rendered as an interruption in the flow of routine, a hand reaching, a gesture repeated, knowledge passed without spectacle, ceremony, or hierarchy. What these fragments demonstrate is neither clarity nor intention. It is only proximity, moments of teaching embedded in the fabric of home, as shaded and partial as the pigment itself. Each fragment is boxed now, labelled and stored. Joins are marked with soft pencil, their adjacency more tentative than certain. Conservation tape runs along the edge of a possible fit, enough to suggest, never enough to assure. The imagery dims under filtered light, colours reduced and edges blurred. That which was vivid is now subdued, an afterimage, a hesitation. Memory is lodged in stone, but stone crumbles, and absence becomes the most consistent feature of the archive. Who learned from whom at the loom before a priest signed the lesson? The assumption settles quietly in the background, rarely disturbed, persistent and weightless as dust in a still room. Fermented beverages, so the textbook lines repeat, entered this world in the hands of the elect, poured, measured, and consumed beneath the facades of ritual. A sealed, prescribed transaction. The vessel carries more than its content, a mark of occasion, an offering, a passage. Here the kitchen and the shrine appear cleanly divided, and the moment of fermentation itself is set apart, a secret kept by the few and revealed only in service to the many. Grain, fruit, honey, all awaiting their higher purpose. Anointed only in the shadowed precincts of elite economies. The certainty is architectural, constructed layer by layer, untroubled by question, nearly absolute. And yet, the archive does not remain silent. Within the laboratory's muted light, there emerges a threat to the brittle unity of this belief. A destabilizing signal, faint at first, then undeniable, pressed into the narrow band of a chromatogram. Molecular patterns rising like summer heat from the residue in a pot, barely distinguishable from the silence around them. These are not ritual objects, not treasures of the few, but the anonymous vessels of simple use, cooking pots sunken in earth, forgotten in storerooms, their forms unremarkable, their surfaces worn, half erased by touch and fire. And yet beneath the surface, molecules persist, fermentation's secret trace, plant processing's chemical signature. These are not outcomes the narrative expects. Still, they settle into the evidence, quietly insistent. In the laboratory, there is only the method, the calm repetition of analysis. Samples are taken from the inside curve of a pot. Sensors, solvents, thin glass vials, GCMS, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. The sequence nearly incantatory. The readout forms a forest of peaks, each one pointing to something already dissolved, broken, forgotten. Fatty acids, esters, the fingerprints of time and use, relics of fermentation's slow work. Lipid biomarkers confirm what sight cannot. Each peak is checked against reference compounds. Not a celebration, not a eulogy, only a match, a number, a line. Sample batch numbers accumulate in cold, unembellished logbooks. CH 114, P6, F7. Small marks echoing across the years, recording a trial quietly, patiently. The physical residue is scraped, measured, dissolved, drawn across sensors, initiating a dialogue of traces that, even as it unfolds, maintains silence. No scene is reconstructed, no hand is raised in a toast. No voice interrupts the hum of analysis. The evidence does not seek an audience. Instead, each pot registers its history in negative. A faint ring of residue left when the last liquid dried and sank into the clay, long before anyone named this an archive, or even considered it a question. The pots, shelved upright in anonymous storerooms, present their mute surfaces. Light shifts across them in the half-dark. An observer notes the curvatures, the chipped mouths, the imprints of fingers or leaves half burned away. Photography records the moment the shutter clicks. One more image to be catalogued among thousands, attached to a file number, cross-referenced to a residue chart. The files, thickening year on year, lie fallow. Records recede into silence. The laboratory conclusion, when it appears, is never mythic, only detection, ratios, correspondence. There is no ceremony in the numbers. And so, the tension grows, not in the drama of discovery, but within the hush that surrounds each finding. The world of sacred provisioning, where ritual creates reality, persists in scholarship and story. A world where certain hands always start the process, where certain spaces are privileged, and where history is cleanly divided. Before and after, common and sacred, domestic and ceremonial. Yet here, in these technical archives, another timeline emerges. Before the large-scale rituals, before the implements of display and distribution, residue gathers quietly in unremarkable dwellings. Household production of fermentation not as exception, but as sustained practice, glimpsed only in the molecular afterlife of what was once consumed and forgotten, not remembered as feast or festival, but as habit, as repetition, as the slow, unmarked work of daily life. It is not an accusation. It is not a correction. The evidence remains poised between categories, neither making nor unmaking a world. The reports are tonal, cool, clinical, almost antiseptic in their restraint. Yet in their accumulation, the boundaries of sacred and ordinary begin to blur. The clear lines shudder beneath the weight of data. No answer is offered, no certainty unmasked. One looks again, looking for the moment the grain became something else, tracking the pathway the residue must have followed. From kitchen to storage, from unremarkable act to unanticipated archive. The vessels, catalogued, await attention that rarely comes. Files grow, images lie dormant, thick with the silence of things not yet explained. Time accumulates in the absence, and even here, in the shuffle of reference numbers and bone-white printouts, memory lingers diffuse, unclaimed. Whose pot fermented the grain before it was consecrated? The familiar story rests quietly in the shade of assumption. Towns, it is said, emerge at the will of high authority. A decree pronounced carves a world into order. Plots and roads fanned outward by a master's mandate. The maps, if any, are records of compliance lines, blocks, roads etched with singular purpose. The evidence of central vision thickening reality beneath its shape. Boundaries, settled by figures above. The grid, descending with authority, erases uncertainty. This is the accepted belief repeated, unexamined, settled onto the past as if it could have been no other way. But there is something else, cooling in the drawers of archives, an interruption, less dramatic than it is persistent. Clay tablets, unpretentious in form, almost humble, bear silent witness to another way. Their surfaces are pressed, not with edicts, but with plan drawings, plots, pathways, subtle traces of scale. Each impression resists grand abstraction. These are not the diagrams of a single will imposed upon empty earth. They are something slower, older, plan impressions, scaled notations, marginal marks that whisper from the periphery. Fold marks, creased into permanence, chart the crossings of hands, the passage of use, the cycle of reference. A sequence of images emerges. The clay, once soft, receives the pressure of a stylus. A partial plot, a hesitant road, a fragmentary border that does not insist on itself. The legend in the margin calculates, adjusts, second guesses. The first stroke, shadowed lines, reinforced or abandoned with the passing of time, cross each other irregularly. The scale is noted, not with the relentlessness of regiment, but as a reassurance, a proposal moored to uncertainty. Marginal notes, brief and almost apologetic, query the width of a lane, mark a neighbouring wall receding or pushed forward. There is no grid, there is repetition, an ongoing arithmetic, shaded by human hands. What survives is neither grand narrative nor epic testament. The residue is archival, plain, mute testimony to negotiated space. These plan drawings do not argue for authority. Their geometry is modest, arrayed to accommodate disruption, recalibration, the friction of neighbours. Increment gives way to increment, lots adjusting, footpaths bending, edges blurring where two intentions meet. Across tablets, the same plot emerges in variant form, truncated here, expanded there. The plan wavers. In some places, the ink is gone, lost to centuries of slow abrasion. In others, the pressure of a hand remains, the curve of a palm etched as absence. The drawer holds the tablets now, each one, a record of negotiation, more than decree. Fold marks slow time to a crawl. The moment of closing, reopening, remeasuring is preserved in the angle of a crease. It is the map as revision, the boundary as dialogue. No central grid runs through these fragments, no ruler's straight edge divides the earth. Instead, one finds evidence of a quieter arithmetic, an edge redrawn, a lane widened, a property boundary remarked in diminishing increments. It is the memory of feet in dust, of eyes returning each morning to recalculate space. All of it anonymous, almost without voice. The pattern is easy to overstate. One tablet might be dismissed as anomaly, a single act of eccentric mapping, but the repetition gives pause. Scales align and misalign. The same marginal hand recurs, correcting measurement, noting the rise of a wall, allowing for the encroachment of a neighbour's shed. The table of contents, such as it is, lists plots not in accordance with imperial order, but by proximity, adjacency, a slow ripple outward from an unremarkable hub. Once soft clay, now brittle, the surface is crossed by cracks where once there was only pliancy. The plans have acquired age, but not clarity. They resist narrative. They resist assignment to a single author, a single moment, a single purpose. Impressions fade into ambiguity. Scale notations drift sometimes clear, sometimes indecipherable. Marginalia, half absorbed by the body of the clay, are silences as much as records. What is missing is as telling as what is present. Voids where numbers might have gone. Spaces left empty at the edge of a plot. Time moves here without ceremony. Each reader becomes observer, witness, archivist, measuring what can be seen and feeling the roughness of what has been lost. There is no decisive line between past intention and current memory, only the gradual accretion of record. Nothing is resolved. The tablets, for all their horizontal breadth, offer no explanation, no origin. Their very presence gestures toward a before and after, a process that resists the clarity of imposition. The customary image of a ruler's straight line on open land is left unratified. What remains is a soft unfolding, not the pronouncement of order, but its gradual, ambiguous assembly. Lines are drawn and redrawn. Boundaries form in the space between certainty and revision. Memory pools in the cracks, the dust, the folds where the plan was once bent and carried away. Perhaps it was always this way, or perhaps only for a while. The tablets cool, their surfaces blurring further, with each passing year a record both stark and dissolving, each reading fainter than the last. The question, never quite spoken, persists beneath every line. Who measured and remeasured the lane before a ruler drew the first straight line? It is quietly assumed, with a firm yet unspoken certainty, that the arrival of new elites signals a wholesale renewal of the population beneath them. The foundational myths speak through grand narratives of replacement, enacting a drama of sudden endings and new beginnings. Before and after two realms, neatly divided, it is tempting to let such boundaries shape the past, to imagine that each vessel of new authority is a vessel emptied and refilled, names changed, faces altered. The story, rehearsed and repeated, becomes almost a rhythm, the arrival, the transformation, the erasure. But in the long silence beneath stone and dust, the evidence accumulates without regard for these dividing lines. In excavation reports, on lab tables under indirect lighting, the remains record neither drama nor rupture, only measured continuity. Osteological analysis unveils its restraint in columns of numbers, in morphometric descriptions, in the quiet revealing of familiar contours. Graves, handled by gloved hands, surrender their records of age and sex and the subtle marks of long-lived anatomies. The crania align, echoes of kin across unknown decades. Mandibles, femora, sequences stable across sedimentary layers associated with change. In the background hum of DNA sequencing, coverages spread across timelines where the myths marked thresholds. Tablets fill with ancient DNA coverage notes, spreadsheets sorted by repository codes. Here, mitochondrial haplogroup tables repeat patterns with understated regularity. Maternal lineage frequencies drift just within expected range, like slow tides on the edge of memory. Burial lists numbers, ages, groupings, find no abrupt shift, no definable new presence. With each metric dataset logged and relogged, what emerges most is the absence of interruption. The bones are read as texts without margin, their language one of recurring detail. A subadult, 6 years, with minor pathology. An adult female, preserved enamel, mitochondrial haplogroup assigned. Reference code inscribed beneath fragile vertebrae. Skeletal series, spanning strata before and after the supposed arrival, mirror each other in the slow repetition of form. The data yield continuity in genetic markers, in the breadth of pelvic arcs, in dental measurements archived under catalogue darkened by the years. Each trait quietly reiterates persistence. There is a measured rhythm in the lab. Sample, sequence, record. Metric, compare. Store. The accumulation is meticulous, and the silence deliberate. Old names flicker against repository ledgers. New labels stack, but the markers within remain constant, uneventful in their stability. The human remains do not declare allegiance to rupture. There is only the enduring presence encoded in fragments passed from one burial to the next. A silent chorus of slight variations carried inside the marrow. The report waited in calm. Devoid of anticipation, lists age, sex, pathology, genetic variants. Changes, if present, are diffused, incremental, insufficient to paint a portrait of arrival or conquest. The tension rests, unresolved, between what the model expects and what the archive permits. Strings of data, once separated by layers of soil and myth, now flatten into rows on digital screens. The code number speaks where names have been lost. Repository Unit 42, C, Individual 13, Mitochondrial H1A, Dental metric set complete. The shape of the orbital cavity, angle of mandible, The distance from Glabella to Nasian, these, captured and confirmed, demonstrate continuity not easily ascribed to replacement. The evidence is neither boastful nor reluctant. It waits, subject only to the reader's inference, lying quiet within the lists, tables, and preserved bones. In the dust and night of the storerooms, under the institutional hush, questions come and go without disturbance. What is left unrecorded is as eloquent as what is archived. The absence of sudden change, the subdued constancy etched into bone and sequence, unsettles. Is the myth of roots severed and replanted a projection as brittle as parchment? There are no outcries against erasure, only the subtle signal of presence unbroken. The names overlying the landscape may have changed, the rituals and tokens altered, but the substratum remains eerily familiar, as though the centuries traced patterns in the same living clay. Yet there is no judgment in these records, no confirmation or denial, only a sequence of observations suspended between threshold and continuum. Age, variant, code. The data accumulate, cycle, and accumulate again. The bones rest as they have always rested, archived under new systems, numbered and recatalogued, specimens in a quiet procession. Each bearer of markers passes unnamed through the narrative of myth and surface politics, enduring in the lacunae between what is said and what is found. Who, in the silence, bore these indelible markers through the generations before a new name was spoken aloud? The great arc of human origin, so often told, unfolds as textual prologue and urban foundation. For centuries, for those who study and for those who remember, the first human stories are bound tightly to the appearance of the city, to the upright stones of temples, to the ordering of law, to writing pressed into wet clay or fixed in ink. Authority, most say, arrives alongside brick and glyph. The most enduring frameworks are composed from tablets, scrolls, and chronicles. Here are beginnings rendered in lines, in letters, in classification. Here, it is assumed, narrative itself is born. That which is monumental in the story of us arises with the city wall and the chiseled edict. Human origins are thought to be legible only where script and monument gaze down from urban heights. Yet, something else adheres to stone far from such settlements. Quiet, exposed, and overlooked. Evidence persists, not in the measured grid of city streets, but on remote faces of rock, eroded and wind-polished, far from markets and courts. There, the intrusion. Layered panels scored by hand, pigment fading into lichen, long lines unwinding the movements of unrecorded years. It begins in the uplands, on ledges perched above empty valleys, where a low sun sharpens the grain of the outcrop. Survey teams pass in silence, charting GPS coordinates against the trembling chirr of insects in the grass. It is the work of hours, sometimes days, marked by a rhythm of halting, observing, writing, moving on. Observers approach the stone, dust trailing from their boots, equipment hanging quiet at their sides. Their voices are faint and careful, tripping only on the technical language of fieldwork. The sound of pencils and nylon straps, the narrowed focus of lenses. Here, the stone rises, a skin mapped by old efforts, almost erased by frost and time. The panels are not isolated, or perhaps not entirely alone. They recur, sometimes miles apart, repeating with a kind of understated insistence. Record keepers note positions, alignments, the angle of faces to the prevailing wind, the accumulation and composition of lichen cover. Each new inscription, a loop, a procession, a curve of stick figures, burdened with tools, flanked by lines marking trails, features, occasionally animals threaded together, as if along well-trodden routes. These motifs repeat, their conventions not urban but consistent. Herding, movement, the terse signs of camp life, fire, enclosure, temporary dwellings, faint traces of tool use. Methodical and neither rushed nor ornamental, the execution preserves a discipline of sign rather than a landscape of abstraction. GPS readings, numbers etched into the memory of handheld devices, a latitude, a longitude, decimals carrying echoes of footsteps to a particular boulder. Orientation noted, south-facing, angled 10 degrees from the horizontal, lichen density thickest in crevices, pigment remnants surviving only in those shielded by an overhang, weathering metrics recorded, the difference between the deliberate incision and the action of rain, ice, dust. Descriptions remain tightly neutral, the observer naming only what is present and measurable. Panel dimensions, tonal gradation of patina, relative preservation. What can be guessed is held at a distance. No names, no gods, no legends chiseled into the silent surface. There are no thrones, no folding of myth over foundation stones, no divine figures presiding. The scenes lean toward the persistent and the practical, the ambiguous in-between of the everyday, yet the repetition across miles remains unsettled, suspended between habit and intention. Some lines overlay older marks, the shadow of one movement passing over another, the faint residue of pigment clouded by the crust of centuries. Here, evidence is not so much a declaration as a question registered in strata and sequence, an itinerary, not a proclamation, a series of routes, not a city's claim to memory. The archive accumulates not in ink, but in patina, sometimes blackened, sometimes green with lichen, sometimes faded to near invisibility. The act of recording persists long after its purpose is lost. The panels turn into the wind, the motifs breathing faintly where the rock surface curves out of direct sunlight, protected by chance from the worst decay. Yet, even the shelter of stone is partial. Bit by bit, the story unravels. Motifs fall into silence. Shapes that once signaled meaning become indistinct lines, their connection to hand, eye, purpose growing faint with each change of season. Those who measure, who note, who record, they neither declare nor deny. Their accounts gather slowly, each new panel a data set, each trace another increment in the layering of uncertainty. There is no certainty here, no final declaration. Instead, the evidence accumulates and subsides, the record pulsing gently in the margins, resisting closure. The persistence of these marks so far from the systems of power and language that would later name themselves the beginning. Trails without cities, movement without archive, absence woven into the very fabric of what remains. What weight does a story carry when it is cut into stone and left to weather, unclaimed by monumental city or script? Who carved those itineraries into stone before a city wrote its letter of origin?